Good afternoon, everybody. EcoAthletes champions and climate-minded athletes from all over the world, thank you for joining us for today's conversation about how we can turn our clothes into a force for good. I'm Lou Blaustein, the founder and CEO of EcoAthletes, a nonprofit that was launched in April of 2020 to inspire and coach athletes to lead climate action. Or another way of saying it, to find and deploy the Muhammad Ali's, the Billie Jean Kings, the Marcus Rashfords, and the Megan Rapinos of the climate fight, because we don't have time for athletes to stay on the sideline anymore. We've built up a network of 65 EcoAthletes champions, climate-minded, climate-curious, and climate-active athletes from all over the world, over 30 sports, women, men, active and retired, who are ready to make a difference on climate. And we are happy to co-produce today's event with the Loopt Foundation, and you'll hear more about them when Scott Welch comes to join us later on. But now I want to introduce another Lou, and that would be Lauren Lou Barnes, the captain of the OL Reign and an EcoAthletes champion. She has really helped the Reign become arguably the greenest team in North American sport. And she's done so in partnership with her assistant general manager, Santi Gallo. They have developed the MAD kit, and she will talk about the MAD kits in a second. And so I'm not going to steal Lou's thunder anymore. Without any further ado, Lauren Lou Barnes of the OL Reign.
Hi, it's Lou Barnes. I play for OL Reign, and I'm so excited to have you guys all here for our chat today with Maxine. I've been playing professional soccer for about 10 years. I grew up in Southern California, where a lot of my inspiration to protect the environment started. I've traveled all around the world with soccer, played in Sweden, Australia, and then been up in the Pacific Northwest, luckily, for the last 10 years. And yeah, all my inspiration started there with the ocean. And then I moved up in the Pacific Northwest, and we're still surrounded by so much water. And then unfortunately, when the pandemic hit, it kind of sparked some more interest for me with the environment and single-use plastic. I designed a MAD kit for our team in particular. Hopefully that kind of expands through our league and more leagues around the world, and potentially big tournaments like the World Cup and Olympics. I took a poll with the team to see kind of what we used most, and decided to look into brands with a history of eco-friendly alternatives. And I talked to about 40 companies that decided to invest in these MAD kits, which was incredible. And I got to meet and network with a lot of incredible companies doing incredible things for the environment. And then came preseason for the new season. And like when we get our kits, our new boots and stuff, we all had these MAD travel kits. So for the year, we would be able to use no single-use plastic because of these kits. And obviously even years more than just one, because these things last for so long, which is what makes them so unique and incredible. And yeah, so that's kind of where all of this started. And we want to have this conversation about clothes as well, because I think the sports industry in particular, you see with the NFL and the NBA and even the NWSL, we have these little runways where we get to see all these really cool outfits. And, you know, I think our clothes really persuade our brand and what we want. So I think it was really important to have this conversation with Maxine, because I think for our platform, we can definitely have a very impactful conversation about that, because there's people that look up to us. You see our jerseys and things like that. Everyone wants to buy these things that the athletes are wearing. So I think it's really important to have these conversations, because it is such a special space with athletes, and we can definitely use our platform for the better. And you see that with even Jazz It Up, one of my teammates. She designed her own eco-friendly clothing line, and it's definitely taken off, and we wear it all the time, especially our team. She played for the Reign. She's now at LA. But yeah, it's just really cool to see these unique pieces coming out and being able to support something, you know, where it's made, the quality of it, the people behind it, and how impactful that is to, you know, the whole line of people involved in making these garments. So I think that's really important for athletes to rethink what we buy, do your research, and make just better choices. And I think having these conversations opens everyone's eyes to this. I think, maybe 5 years ago, I've always been really passionate about the environment, but now looking into more things like my clothes and being able to do research, I just get a much more fulfillment out of what I wear and put on myself, because it's so important to know where it's coming from and how hard it is to make these garments and the people behind it. You just have so much more pride in wearing those things when you know the people behind it. And I think that's really important. And I've really seen that with someone like Jazz It Up, and then reading Maxine's books, seeing one garment from how it's made to the end, it is just incredible to see like the amount of time and effort and things that go into those designs. So I'm really excited to have everyone here. Thank you for joining us. I know it's crazy hours around the world, but I think these are really important conversations that we need to be a part of and continue to push, and especially in the athletic industry, these conversations, so we can, better the world and just make a really positive impact.
Thank you so much, Lou, and thank you for all the work that you and Santiago and your teammates at the Reign have done to make the Reign the greenest team in North American sports, and to turn the Mad Kits into something that can be an example for all sports teams. Now I'd like to introduce our special guest speaker for this afternoon, and that is Maxine Bedat, who is the author of Unraveled, The Life and Death of a Garment. And it is an incredible read. I urge all of you to read it. Maxine basically traveled the world following a piece of clothing, a pair of jeans to be exact, from when the cotton is picked to when the jeans are dumped into landfill. And she is an expert on the environmental and social toll that the apparel industry takes on our world, and has ideas on how we can change that. Maxine is one of the leaders of a movement to turn sustainable fashion into law in the United States. So she's got a lot to offer today, and to start our conversation about how we can turn our clothes into a force for good, I couldn't think of a better person than Maxine Bedat. Maxine?
As Lou mentioned, I'm Maxine Bedat. I'm the director of the New Standard Institute, and we're a think and do tank that uses data and the power of citizens to turn the fashion industry into a force for good. I often have thought about, why is this industry, why do we know so little about it when we're beginning to know a lot more about things like the food industry or the auto industry? It is often an industry that is dismissed as fun and frivolous. It's probably some misogyny baked into the fact that we can't conceive of this industry that is targeted to women, that it could be such an impact on the world. But it's an enormous $2.5 trillion industry. More than 100 million garments are produced every year. And that's a new wardrobe for every man, woman, and child on the planet every single year, a new replaceable wardrobe every year. It's a leading global employer of women. And it's very hard when we're thinking about this scale of this industry. I have a hard time thinking, just wrapping my hands around figures around tons and trillions. But one country produces enough textile to go around the world more than 1,219 times. That's every year. So it's just an enormous, enormous industry. Okay. What I just wanted to do in the next 20 minutes is walk through this basic life cycle, from the fiber to the yarn and textile creation, what happens at cut and sew, our own relationship to clothing, what happens when we get rid of it. And then I know that we're closing out with brainstorming on what we can do. So the reason why the talk is called There's No Such Thing as Sustainable Fashion is that the industry has largely been dominating the conversation around the impacts of the industry. And as a result, what has happened is there are companies that call themselves sustainable, or there are collections within traditional companies that there are sustainable lines. And I think what is problematic about all of that is ignoring the elephant in the room in all of this, which is just how much clothing we are consuming and the speed at which clothing is being pushed. And so when it becomes just this oh, I just need to buy the sustainable thing versus the not sustainable thing. We don't get to engage with the important, very significant part of the fashion industry, which is just how disposable it's become recently. So now we're going on this journey. And basically this presentation is a very quick high level of the book. So the book tells a story of a pair of jeans, and I travel around the world from a farm to a farm in Texas, textile mill in China, cut and sew in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and then back to the US, and then to Ghana to look at the secondhand clothing industry. So this is a very brief version of that. So any garment that starts out its life as a fiber, it's either happening on a cotton field, flax farm, or more commonly today in an oil rig, because by and large, our fibers today are plastic fibers that are going into our clothing. So I just wanted to keep this chart in mind. This is the energy use that is required to create each of these fibers. And you'll see that the synthetic fibers, your polyester, acrylic, nylon, have a significantly more higher energy impact than your natural fibers. Why does this matter? Because this is what has happened to fiber production over the past several decades. 2001 is when H&M first opened in New York. And so you can really see the rise of polyester with the rise of these fast fashion, like super cheap, super fast clothing companies like your H&M, your Zara, your Boohoo, your Sheins of the world. They really have risen because of the rise of this synthetic fabric, and just polyester is a synthetic and polyester is plastic. So that is just another fancier word for a type of plastic. And so that's why researchers, as they're finding microplastic pollution around the world, a leading cause of that microplastic pollution is our clothing. It is critical to understand the intersectionality of the impact of the fashion industry with slavery and colonialization. If you chart even the trade routes today of our clothing, it maps pretty squarely onto colonial trade routes. And you cannot tell the story of cotton without talking about the story of slavery. It's really important to understand how these things intersect. And there's a great site called the Intersectional Environmentalist that breaks this down even further. So please go to their site. They have really great information on that. I've picked out kind of the things that I hear a lot that people seem to be confused about because marketing has made it very confusing. So the one thing we call these the washing out the greenwash is that organic clothing does not mean sustainable clothing. The organic standard is only in reference to what is happening at the farm. So if a like cotton t-shirt is being sold as an organic t-shirt, it means that no synthetic chemicals were used on the farm. It doesn't mean that there's no impact on the whole production. And as we go through this and kind of walk through each step of the production, you'll see why having just the no synthetic chemicals used in the fiber production actually bears very little to its total impact at the end once it's finally a garment. Another thing to keep in mind that we see a lot, especially today, is these recycled plastic bottle clothing. And it'll say like, this shirt has saved 10 plastic bottles from landfill. That's just not true because this is what we have to understand about this entire market is first, the thing that keeps the plastic bottle from entering a landfill is whether we have put it in the recycled plastic bottle bin. That's what makes it go to landfill or not go to landfill. A plastic bottle, once we put it in the recycling, it can either become a plastic bottle again, or it can become a recycled polyester garment. Once it's become a recycled polyester garment, there is at scale at the moment, there isn't an ability to turn that garment into another thing again. And so it ends up going into landfill. Whereas if you have a plastic bottle, you can continue to make it another plastic bottle several more times. And what's happening is that the beverage industry and the clothing industry is competing for these plastic bottles. So it's more complicated than just using plastic bottles for recycled polyester clothing. Let's think about jeans, because I'm wearing jeans at the moment. That cotton has been grown on a farm, it's been picked, and now it is been ginned, and now it is in a bale, and it has been shipped probably to a place like China, which is where most of the textiles of the world are produced. So then that bale of cotton will arrive at the textile mill, and it's going to go through all of these steps: opening, blending, cleaning, batting, carding, drying, combing, roving, spinning. That's just to get to a thing that we call yarn. And then it will be woven or knit, sized, scoured, bleached, mercerized, dyed, and finished. What all of these steps, I have naturally curly hair, so that the way I think about this whole process is that the fiber coming in is like a tangled mess. And all of these processes, in order to get yarn that we think of, all of those fibers have to be unwound from that tangled mess, put all in the same direction. They keep having to go through this. They keep having to be cleaned of any impurities, and then they are spun together so the fibers don't fall apart when we, wear our clothes. And then they are woven and knit into the fabrics that we know of as our clothing. An important thing to know about clothing fibers is they don't naturally love dyes. And so all of the steps, the sizing, scouring, bleaching, mercerizing, dyeing, and finishing, takes a lot of heat in order to affix those chemicals and keep them on the fibers of our clothing. And all of these steps together take enormous amounts of energy, and it's happening in places like China that still use a coal-based power grid. And so that is why the fashion industry is responsible from anywhere between 4 and about 9% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. It's really because of this step in the process. And when you combine all of that with how disposable our clothing has gotten, that's why the fashion industry is a real hotspot for global greenhouse gas emissions. The textile mill phase is where 76% of the carbon footprint of clothing happens. And why does this matter? Why I really need to emphasize this is that anytime we think about like an exciting new fiber technology, that's really important because it's potentially reducing the impact where it says that fiber part. But anytime you have a new textile that still has to be spun and woven and dyed again, you still have this enormous part of the pie. So to me, when I look at this chart, I think about, we need all of these new technologies and to improve the fiber, but we really need to focus on energy efficiency upgrades at our textile mills. And what we really need to do is wear our clothing more. Because when we look at the data, and we are a data-based organization, the single most important thing that an individual can do, and us as a society, is wear our garment more. That's going to drive the most impact reduction, is just wearing the clothing that we have more. This phase is also where the chemicals are applied in the process of creating our clothing. I remember coming across this statistic in a peer-reviewed journal about 1/3 of the weight of our clothes is chemicals. And I was just like completely blown away by that. And that's the chemicals that remain on our clothing, but a lot of it doesn't remain on our clothing. It gets dumped in the rivers, in the places where they are produced. So this was a trip that I took in Guangdong in China, and this was just behind the textile mill that I was touring. And you can see it's kind of black effluents, these black chemicals coming from the textile mill into an already very dark gray river. I walked along the banks of this river, and these were farm plots that were adjacent to it. And so people are then consuming that water for their agricultural purposes, which is really troubling. That's why when we talk about sustainably sourced materials, there are all these terms that are being used, whether it's greenwashing or green wishing, all of these terms that are being used by brands that aren't terribly clear as to what it is that they mean. And so we really need to know from a company, what is it, what impact are they trying to reduce, rather than saying these vague terms that could mean they're saving water, but then using more chemicals, or they're using fewer chemicals, but have more greenhouse gas emissions. So we need from the industry more clarity, and for us as citizens to not be confused by the confusing vocabulary around the industry. Okay, so now we have our fiber. It's been either grown in a field or it's come from an oil rig and processed into polyester. That fiber has come into a textile mill. It has been spun into yarn, woven or knit, dyed, finished, looks like the textile that will eventually become our clothes. That textile will then get shipped to places like Bangladesh or elsewhere in China. The industry has gone to where the labor is the cheapest, which tends to be where there is the most exploitation. We don't tend, especially in the States, to be able to see inside a garment facility. This is a picture from a factory in Bangladesh that produces for brands that you know and have certainly worn. I have. Every single seam, every placard, every button is sewn still by a person, or usually a woman, as you can see from here, sitting at a sewing machine. That has not changed. The way in which clothing has been produced has not changed significantly in the past 100 years. But what is happening is, as you can see from this picture, well, you can kind of see, the fabric will come in, it will be cut into the shape of the garment, and then rows of people are set up with their sewing machines. What you can see, these little green things are swings. So a woman will sew her seam, she'll clip up the product, and she'll keep swinging it forward. And each of these steps are measured by the second, by industrial engineers that set up these lines. And what it creates is incredibly intense work environments, because if one person gets behind, everybody gets behind. So it's an orchestra in many ways, but it is humans that are having to measure their production in seconds. And it is deeply stressful. You cannot take breaks. People are, being asked to work 14-hour days in these very intense environments. And I think in doing research for the book, what was deeply distressing to think about is that this industrial engineering, the idea of measuring somebody's output by second, really got its start in the cotton fields in the time of slavery in the American South. And it is the same techniques that are being used in the cut and sew facilities. And it's honestly the same techniques that are used also in places like Amazon distribution facilities, where you are measuring output by your product every second. I'm a geriatric millennial. So as somebody who in my youth have seen sort of the rise of H&M and Zara, your real fast fashion companies, and now Shein's and Boohoo's, in our grandparents' generation, or in the 1960s, I won't say which generation that is, in the 1960s, 95% of clothing that American wore was American made. And today that's less than 2%. So what has happened is we developed some standards about our labor and our environment, and then the world globalized, and the industry, because it's very mobile. It's an industry that you can set up a factory pretty easily. It has hopped to the places with the lowest wages. And it's meant that countries compete to protect their workers the least. And so that's why you have the fashion industry being produced in places like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Ethiopia that has some of the lowest wages globally. I think that's an important context in this, is that absence of having legal protections for workers, companies have come up with this code of conduct. It's basically like their own laws. The only problem is they don't enforce their own laws, and they don't actually ensure that the amount that they are spending, they're purchasing, can even cover, like the brands paying the factories. They don't ensure that they are paying enough that the workers then could get paid something like a living wage. And so that's why it's not just the factories that are implicated, it's the brands themselves. This is another just like vague language that we see in this space around radical transparency. That's very meaningless. Like if you just take a picture of a nice factory, that's not the type of transparency that we need to see. We need to see disclosures around wages, around representation, around working conditions, around environmental impact. That's the type of transparency that's really meaningful in this space. Like a picture of a nice factory is not particularly helpful. So now we have our whole product and it's been shipped to us. I think the conversation tends to happen at this stage is like, why are people buying so much clothing? Like, why has clothing become so disposable? Why are young people like, they just don't care? And I think that's not true and not fair. I think what we ignore in all of this is how much young people are being given messages of consumption and pressure to consume. And if we think about like social media and the attention economy, young people are like addicted to social media because it's meant to be addictive. And then on top of it, there is a lot of peer pressure, of course, especially for younger people. And so they're seeing all of these messages. And I think it is sometimes influencers that aren't aware of what they are doing in the broader system that they are a part of, but they end up, being seen in new clothing all the time. And so that's what then the people who are influenced by these influencers end up seeing. And I think that's why with like real influencers, right? Not the bad kind, like the ones we really want to look up to, the very powerful role that you have to play in showing kind of what a sustainable lifestyle is and how wearing clothes more than one time is cool and perfectly normal. I think it's something one might not think about, but has a really powerful normalizing impact in seeing that like, oh, I've seen this athlete wear this thing more than once, and that is normal. So I can feel okay about doing that. And there's research out of the UK that has found that young women consider clothing old after having worn it only once or twice. It's 1 in 3 women find clothing old after they've worn it once or twice. And that's being a part of this influencer society and social media. And yeah, you guys have a powerful role to play in changing that. Circularity is really important part of this puzzle. To reduce, reuse, and recycle is incredibly meaningful term and an important component, but it's been used and co-opted by some parts of the industry to just be like, oh, we just have to find this magic material and then we're good. And we can continue consuming at this insane speed. But I think just looking back at the chart that I had mentioned before, you can see why whenever you are recycling something, you are reducing the impact, but you're not making that impact to zero, and so that's the important thing to keep in mind is that if we can extend the life of our garment, if we can wear those things more times and normalize that and celebrate that, in addition to having this recycled world, that's really going to be the place we need to go to have a fashion system that can exist within the bounds of the planet. There's a lot of claims about carbon neutrality, like this product is carbon neutral, this company is carbon neutral. And just another thing to be wary of, because carbon neutral can either mean that the company is trying to reduce their impacts within their own supply chain. So within the fashion industry, it would do things like help improve energy efficiency in textile factories and turn to green energy in those facilities. Or it can mean that a company doesn't do any of that and they buy carbon offsets. And carbon offsets are, here I have a good definition of it, an action or activity such as planting trees or investing in a wind farm that compensates for the emission of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So it can continue, like the fashion company could continue pumping up all that coal to fuel the textile mills and then buy like a tree farm somewhere, which in theory would be fine, but in practice, it's not working. And companies are buying these really cheap offsets, but the research into them has found that a lot of them are not what they promise to be. And it ends up just being false carbon accounting. And the thing I just always remind myself is like, the planet does not care about creative accounting. The planet only sees the net impact at the end. And so what's really important is that companies are working in their supply chain to reduce their impact. Okay, this is the very last thing, is what happens when we get rid of our clothing? by and large, people are still throwing their clothing out. 80% is being thrown out. And that amounts to about 80 pounds of textile per person per year, which is quite staggering. But even when we donate our clothing, we tend to think, or I certainly did before doing the research in this space, that when it's donated, it goes to a good cause and we can feel really good about ourselves. When we donate to a place like a Salvation Army, or the jerseys that for the losing team that are never worn, very little of that actually gets sold in the Salvation Army stores. A big portion, about 96% of that, is going to be bundled up, put in a bale, and shipped to the global south. And so this was a picture that I took in Accra in Ghana. This was a landfill that serviced the secondhand market in Accra. And what is happening is that as the clothing that we are purchasing is becoming more disposable, if we don't like it, it's going to be hard to find somebody else who does, who finds value in it. And so what researchers are finding is that even in these secondhand markets, this was some research that was done in the Kantamanto, the secondhand market in Accra, that 40% of that clothing doesn't find a home at all. It ends up in places like this landfill or being burned. And so we ultimately are exporting our waste to countries that haven't asked for it and that have less capacity for waste management than we do. So it's something to really think about, just the speed at which we're doing this and the impact that that has around the world. So I will leave it at that. And I know this is the start of a broader conversation, but can also just speak about the work of the New Standard Institute and the law that we are a part of advancing in New York to try to address some of these issues. But with that, I'll turn it back.
Awesome, Maxine, and thank you so much. Thank you for illuminating us and bringing this issue to a broader audience. And what I would like to do, Maxine and Lou have done a great job of talking about clothes and their contribution to the climate crisis, environmental crisis. We are in the midst of a humanitarian crisis in Ukraine as well. And I just wanted to note that. So for next steps, what we'd like to do is ask some questions. First, we will go to our friend from Ottawa, Shay Smith, Olympian in both Winter and Summer Olympics, mind you, Maxine. We have a dual Olympian who is just back from Beijing and truly a champion among EcoAthletes champion. How about that for an introduction, Shay Smith?
Can't be beat, Lou. Thanks. Hey everyone, Maxine, really enjoyed your talk. I have a bunch of questions. The first one is the actonfashion.org. That isn't the website, or at least I can't access it.
Oh my God, sorry. It's the Fashion Act. That's terrible. That was my fault.
What is it, Maxine? I'll put it in the chat.
Thefashionact.org. Thank you.
Thefashionact. There you go.
Thanks. The second question is, there's a lot of sporting events out there at the grassroots that give prizes to athletes just for participating to get people there. There's lots of teams at the Olympic level and down below that give clothing. I mean, I just got this a couple of weeks ago and I was feeling pretty good about it until this chat here. I can't imagine Lululemon is this doesn't feel like it's 100% cotton. What recommendations would you have to the clubs and organizations who are just buying the cheapest material out there to give as presents? And then also, what recommendation would you have for us to give to those national teams that give every year a new kit that gets athletes excited? But I mean, what's the alternative? Two questions there.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'm like so deeply intimidated by all of you. That's just very impressive what you are doing. So it's definitely a longer conversation, but I think that, and we found this in the modeling industry, I think it's an interesting parallel where models will come in and say, these are the requirements I have if I am going to work with your brand. And I think an interesting, thinking about the power that athletes have, an interesting parallel that could happen. There isn't one standard that I can say, like, this is an easy thing to say, demand X, Y, and Z. But I think that we certainly have the tools within the New Standard Institute for the working with those brands on what those standards should be. So I think it would be a conversation versus this is my requirement, but you have power certainly within asking those questions. And I'm grateful that you're thinking about it. And that would be something like we would be super happy and would love to explore, just saying like, would you have a conversation, with New Standard Institute or Lou, to get that conversation going?
Yeah, for sure. I'll keep that in mind when I chat with Lou again offline. It's a good idea.
Now we have Michael Warner, who is a hockey enthusiast and also has helped us at EcoAthletes over the past year or so, doing great work on special projects and developing our brand. So now, Michael Warner, the floor is yours.
I appreciate that, Lou, and also Lou and Maxine. I appreciate all of the insight and the presentation as well. This question is for Maxine. So if there is no such thing as sustainable fashion, are there any brands that you lean towards when you are shopping? Because I am currently wearing some Vuori joggers. I love Vuori joggers. And as a major reason of how I wanted them is I needed to lift my brand of into that sustainable side. However, after your presentation, I'm not so sure about it now.
Yeah, I'm always the bearer of bad news. None of this is supposed to be from a place of guilt, right? And to make anybody feel bad. I think what I'm trying to say is that anything that you love means that you're going to wear it a lot. And so wherever that comes from is probably going to be the best barometer of what is good. That's what I would say to your average citizen. I think it's a bit different, with athletes that are influencers themselves, because what they wear influences other folks. So it's hard for me to pinpoint, one brand that is doing an amazing job across every sector. I know Patagonia gets a lot of applause for good reason. They are doing a lot of good work, but their main product is still a polyester fleece. So I think the simple answer is anything that you're going to wear often is the right thing, and you should feel good about that. I think for an influencer and thinking about the brands that they would represent, I think that would be a bigger conversation, engaging with the brand and saying, what are your standards? I want to represent, the brands that I wear. I want them to reflect my values and the things I care about, and having that conversation to get a better understanding and to ensure that those companies are moving in the right direction. And I think also, because this has happened with another celebrity that was very excited because they were doing a collection with a company and it was a special sustainable collection. But if the company overall isn't moving in the right direction and they're just using your name to sell a sustainable collection, that's not moving the needle in the most significant way. I think athletes can really help move the needle by engaging with the brands and saying, if we're going to be wearing you and representing you, this is what we want to have happen across your company. And I would just say, there is so much power in that I think people don't realize. There is so much power in asking that question back and not just, signing up. Even not influential, athletes, just regular people sending emails to brands asking that question has power. So even more powerful when the athletes do it.
We have one more. We have Doug Lynch, who is both a retired NHL and professional hockey player, and also I know there's no such thing as sustainable fashion, but let's say in the fashion that's trying to do better. over to Doug.
First of all, yeah, thanks, Lou, both Lou's, and then thanks, Maxine. Thank you guys for organizing this, put us on. This was extremely helpful. I basically just had the one thing was I really liked Maxine, not really like, but one of the biggest call-outs I had at your presentation was realizing that these are still made by hand. And I think we get so caught up in that deal with robots and the assembly lines now with the Teslas of the world that's all automated. Like I was like you were, I was looking down at my shirt as you were talking, going like, the appreciation that you start having when you really realize how our clothes are made, that really hit home to me. It sounds kind of strange, but like it's so simple, but that really hit home with me in your part of your presentation. So I really appreciated that. And then the biggest thing I think is that paradigm shift of education, just educating, because this has been a passion of mine now for the last 3 years. And I'm floored every time I hear presentations like this. And it does feel like it's a daunting task and you're one person involved in this, but I just want to say how much I enjoy the presentation and don't really have a question so much, but it's just a pleasure to meet everybody. And I'm so excited there's other people out there that also are passionate about this and are questioning things. So thank you very much for putting this on.
All right, I'm going to hand it over to Scott from the Loopt Foundation to kind of put things in a bow for a bit. Scott, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lou, and thank you, Maxine, for that incredible presentation. Lou Barnes, thank you for hosting this and bringing together this great group of participants. And all of you, thanks for attending and for your comments and questions. And we definitely look forward to taking this to another level. So Lou, feel free to share the slide if you can. My name is Scott Welch, and I'm the Executive Director of the Loopt Foundation. And again, it's so cool just to be a part of this conversation. Really what I wanted to talk about is both Maxine and Lou are amazing examples of what happens when you combine awareness with personal action. Looking at Lou and how the Make a Difference campaign has the potential to reach the Olympics or the World Cup and really change a whole generation of ideas with sports people. We all know from just listening to Maxine, our clothes absolutely must become a force for good. And if you think about it, we have 8 billion plus people in the world right now. If we want to really affect climate change, we need to affect things that everybody uses. And we also know that our clothing really defines us in a lot of ways. So whether we're out in society, whether we're wearing the kit for whatever team we represent, whether we're out training, representing a brand that might sponsor us, that represents us. And so if we can start to tie sustainability with those types of products that represent us as people and allow us to share our value of sustainability out, we can really make a big difference. And I think Lou and Maxine are perfect examples of that. Neither Lou or Maxine, I think 3 years ago, thought that they might want to change the fashion industry, but they gained some awareness and they looked at it through different filters. And now they're both doing that. And that shows what we can all do. And now that we all have this awareness, what could we actually do together? Because that kind of impact can truly change the world. So rather than just imagine that right now, I want to go a step further. I want to activate. And how can we coordinate our networks, our influence, our combined expertise to truly transform clothes into a force for good? And since we're all together now, I wanted to just throw that out to the group. If you all have anything that immediately comes to mind, hopefully you all were inspired by Maxine's presentation as and I think you probably have some things on your mind. So please feel free and thank you.
Our goal coming out of this is to have a deeper brainstorm where that's the main part of the conversation. But we thought it would be a good idea to get a couple of ideas started so people could see the possibilities. So if you have a thought as to how we can get involved, and actually, do we have Lou, not this Lou, but Lou Barnes?
Yeah. Hi. Actually, we have had conversations at the Rain as to how we can better this, especially with sports teams like ours and what I've obviously seen over the past 10 years as a pro, that we literally buy the same gear pretty much with the same logo printed on it every single year, new ones. So I think this year we've finally kind of done inventory to see like, okay, what things can we not rebuy and just keep reusing the stuff that we have. And I know I think especially a women's sport, it's a little bit easier. We've got a lot less to work with in terms of volume. We were able to go to, our ownership and ask of these things. And they were like, yeah, of course, like, why not? We're going to save money in the long run. And the girls, for us, having these conversations, they're like, yeah, it's so easy just to re-wear, maybe like Maxine was saying, we're going to make a shirt last 3 years. Whereas like over, last decade, we've been getting the same clothes over year and year and year. And then either we try and do something after. We usually go to women's shelters and donate stuff and have good use out of that. But we have had those conversations, which has been great. And I definitely think it's going to change this year. And then even just with our teammates in general, with our lifestyle clothes as well, we've talked about doing a clothes swap where we kind of do a spring cleaning, bring it into the locker room, and we kind of have them up on racks, and people can just go through and reuse clothes, like something. And like Maxine, you said, it's so sad to think like once I've worn one thing, a lot of the world thinks, okay, that it's old now. So it's brand new now with someone else. If we do a clothes swap like that, and the girls are really like inspired by that. And they're really excited about that. We've got a lot of girls on our team too that are upcycling or making, different things with clothes by putting new patches on them, or, using some older clothes to like make new clothes out of those. So it's been really fun to see these conversations with the girls and just how open they have been. And I think a lot of it has come down to the educational part and just honestly having these open discussions within the locker room. And, even what we're doing right now, so many like new ideas come out that you just don't think about, and you put 32 heads together and you find a lot of new avenues and really incredible like ideas that you can kind of initiate. And yeah, so we're doing a lot of that at OL Reign. So I think our next thing is going to be a clothes swap, which will be really cool. And maybe we can engage the community and fans in that as well.
That's what I'm thinking. I think that could be a really cool idea within the Reign, getting your fans involved, but then also, these are champions here, EcoAthletes champions, and the other athletes on this call who are not yet EcoAthletes champions could do clothes swaps with their fan base. And it could actually be something that could be like, I could also see a clothes swap event at a stadium where you bring the players and the fans together, or
Totally.
like a pregame event. Like, like they have events at baseball games where kids sleep on, of course, if they have baseball this year, but that's a whole different issue, where they sleep on the field or whatever. Here you could have clothes swap. And it could be men's and women's.
And just simply, making it cool. So if you can even have it wherever you are in the world, whoever your group of friends are, you all have potentially the same issue, have a little clothes swap party and extend the life of your clothes. So just making it cool, I think, is amazing.
And then we have a suggestion in the chat from Patricia Borometti, who actually designed the logo for our event today. And thank you, Patricia. She's asking that we commit to education for children on the subject, and with athletes being the driver or the teachers, so to say, of that education. So I think we can put that in our brainstorm idea, brainstorm pot. It looks like, Shay, you have another. Did you raise your hand again, or was that from before?
I raise it again.
All right, Shay. Well, you are winter and summer, so you get two. You get two shots.
Yeah. I guess it's an idea and sort of like a question. When the education piece, I agree with. If there's some kind of motto or call to action that can maybe hone in on what exactly we mean by education to make it real for people. For some of the stuff that I do for track, grassroots meets, the sort of call to action for everybody is to measure your impact. Whether it's measure how much waste you produce on a weekly basis, or it's measure how many kilometers you drive to your training session or your events. It's something that individuals can just take away and do, and then cumulatively it has an impact. I can't think of what it would be for the clothing area, but thinking of that and then sort of sharing that in the network would be good. Just something more specific. The second comment I had was, I guess, clothing seasons for Olympic athletes. In some sports, you get like I said, you have a new kit design every year for every season, and everyone's super excited about it. One year it's pink, one year it's like leopard print, and everyone's out there at the top meet sort of showing their stuff. Having some kind of partnership with the clothing vendors, it's Nike, Adidas, Puma, the big ones, to say, let's maybe work on a quad basis. And rather than changing your designs every year, you change it every 4 years to signify the new Olympic season. And we minimize the need for people sort of wanting to get the next new thing it's identical to what it was before. And that's a pretty big ask of the vendors, but maybe Maxine, you've got the weight to do that. And then the third idea I had was just the vendors that were using the Lulus, the Nikes, the Pumas, finding another vendor that like their history is in sustainability, sort of like Patagonia for sport, but on steroids. Or okay, that's a bad analogy. That Patagonia for sport that is just really really good, and their focus is how they make their clothing for athletes, and then you can just sort of shout whoever that is at the top of the mountains. I can't think of one. Maybe one doesn't exist, but there must be somebody out there. There's definitely like a business opportunity there.
The teams are constantly marketing alternative kits. Obviously, they want to sell more stuff. However, does it make sense to at least inject some circularity into that, Maxine, or is that just a kind of a fool's errand? In other words, like, yes, I'm a New York Jets fan. That's pathetic, but whatever. But let's say I have my Jets jersey and I'm done with it. If there was a way to send it back to the Jets and they could make it into a new jersey, is that worth it? Or is it just wear that Jets jersey for 20 years, which I have done, mind you?
I mean, I would go with the latter option. The story that is often told is that, the Nikes are the big sponsors of athletic teams. When, they will create both sets for both teams, in case either one wins. And the other then, like, for the team that loses and doesn't get the championship, that ends up finding its way to
like Super Bowl champion Cincinnati Bengals. They didn't win.
Exactly. Yeah. If there is a way that they actually can be reusing it, then like by all means, let's try to push that. But I think I like the, idea of let's try to not have new product introduced at such a speed, and extending. I like that idea of having it 4 years instead of annually, would be a great thing to try to push for.
I think one other way that athletes can really use their platform, if they so choose, is to get involved in the legislative action that is going on in the United States, and for sure, US athletes on this call. Maxine can talk about that for a second, but I am sure, Maxine, maybe you have some insights. We have Canadians on this call. We have an Australian or two on this call. We have someone from the UK on this call. So all manner of day and night is represented. So maybe that's another thing we can get involved with. Maxine, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the Fashion Act is a bill that's been introduced in New York that the New Standard Institute is getting behind, and it's really creating a floor for how fashion companies would have to operate. So think about it as like the mandatory fuel efficiency standards that California introduced that ended up advancing the auto industry around the world, just because California has such a large market. No company was willing to leave California to keep with their bad standards. So that's really, it's taking a page out of California type legislation and doing things like making companies, mandating that companies operate within the bounds of the Paris Agreement and show demonstrated improvement on wages of garment workers, things like that, demonstrated chemical management. And so we would love support on that. And you don't have to be from New York to support it, and to get people to call their legislators. The bill has also been introduced in Washington. It's going to be introduced in Massachusetts. So the other thing in other jurisdictions that I'm speaking with my lawyer hat on is that you can also have, ask that your legislators pick up the same type of legislation. There's more that can be found on our social page, NSI Fashion 2030. And yes, anybody, please reach out. I'm at Maxine at newstandardinstitute.org. Would love to get just support in advancing that bill, which they're hoping to get passed within this legislative session. So that would be around April or May. And so again, it's a New York bill that would have a global impact because it would impact any company that has global revenues over $100 million that sells in New York. So that's every major fashion company would be implicated and regulated by that bill if it got passed.
And what about for the athletes who are from other countries on the call? Can
So
they,
they
can they lend their voice to what you're doing? Or
Yeah, they can absolutely, both promote the Fashion Act and bring attention to this type of legislation to their representatives. It would ideally be, not just in New York, not just in other states, but a type of regulation that would exist around the world. I think using one's like social media channels to bring attention to these issues, to tag legislators and asking what they're doing about it, because what we have found through this process is we are educating our legislators that this is an issue that they need to pay attention to, and athletes can be very helpful microphones in that regard. And we have like assets that we can help share as well.
so I put Maxine's email address in the chat, and then in the follow-up, I'll put it again. I'll include it in that. But just to be clear, if you're an athlete, active, retired, and you feel that this legislation is something that's important to you and you want to get behind, you don't have to be from New York, you don't have to be from the United States. And Maxine and her group that are advancing the bill are looking for athletes and other influencers to lend their name to this. So if it's okay, Maxine, I'm encouraging them to get in touch.
Yeah, please.
And Lou, if I might add to that, just this is another demonstration of just the power of awareness. If we can make more aware of this, there will be, it's a complex problem. It requires coordinated solutions, including awareness, legislation, many others. So your power to make people aware and make this cool actually just moves us forward. And that's what we really need. And there are other laws. If you look at in France, there's laws around end of life, which is sort of interesting considering that King Louis XIV is probably responsible for the seasons in our fashion industry that have created the most waste, and now seeing them come around on the back end. But we will take those contradictions and turn them into positives, and your awareness actually helps us make that happen.
And then we have one more question from Camila Pirelli, also known as La Pantera Guarani, which is the Guarani panther. The Guarani are the indigenous people of Paraguay. Cami, who just came onto the camera there, she was with just wave. She is an EcoAthletes champion from Paraguay, an Olympian in hurdling, and she also does heptathlon, which is 7 events over 2 days. And she is incredible, and she has this question. What about shoes made out of recycled materials like Nike's casual shoes? I've seen and used them, but the only recycled material I saw was the sole made out of cork instead of plastic, but everything else is the same. I think implied somewhat in that question is there some kind of greenwashing going on?
Like I can sit within Nike and think about that they must be thinking that they're doing a great thing, right? And it is certainly better than the thing that they were producing before that wasn't recycled. It is true that every bit helps, but I also think that it is also true that if we're being marketed a product that is like, oh, this thing is recycled, but yet only one component is, and we don't even know how much that's actually reducing impact, then we're being sold something more than what it is. And so I think it is good. It's an excellent question to be asking. And I think if we are just wearing the shoe, of course, in athletics, it's different because you actually like use through your gear. So it's a bit of a separate question when it's just like a fashion item that you don't need to have another one of. You see companies a lot, they will celebrate that like one component is recycled, but everything else is the same. And yet they're marketing the whole product as a recycled product.
And I want to thank all of the EcoAthletes champions who came on, other athletes, and folks who are around this space who joined us today. We had some brainstorming ideas, clothing swap, getting involved with the legislative campaign, an education campaign as well, with Shay's proviso about making sure we know what we're educating, being sure we know what we're educating about. We will be back in touch with this group to schedule a follow-up brainstorm/presentation, because we want 2022 to be a year of climate action from the EcoAthletes champions and beyond. And so this was the starting point. I'll be in touch with you by email. Again, reach out to Maxine to lend your name if you're at all interested in being part of her movement. And then we'll also ask for your feedback about today's event. Scott, did you want to say a few words as well?
I just want to thank everyone again and let you all know we will send a survey out. We plan on setting a couple different meeting times to do a bigger brainstorm, and we'll set those up for different time zones. So those of you that are trying to either stay awake or just woke up will be in a better place. But again, just an honor to be a part of this and an honor to be with all of you. And I'm super stoked to continue my weekend after this really inspired meeting. Thanks.
And Lou Barnes, you kicked us off. I think now we're in stoppage time. I just had to say that. And so I give it to you to take us out.
Yeah, no, again, thank you guys for coming and joining this. I think we can only do this all together. So continuing to have these conversations with athletes around the world is incredible. And all the support is needed. And Maxine and Scott and Lou, thank you so much for like even providing this platform as well.